My name's, you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Shared screen, okay. So my name's Alan Ashby. Most of what I do is sea kayaking, although my background is in a competition in whitewater racing, in slalom, and in marathon years ago, a long time ago. And I gave up paddling for about 30 years actually, and then came back to it about 7 or 8 years ago. And so that shows you how old I am, by the way. Um, and I now actually run quite a lot of events every year, about 40, because I run all the events for the Cumbria Regional Development Team that are involved in sea kayaking. So a lot of those events are coaching events, single day events, but I also run 2 or 3 expeditions a year internationally, and a lot of away camping, wild camping, principally in the west coast of Scotland and the Highlands and things. So a lot of what I do is organising trips and organising organisers and other leaders to run trips. So and especially when you're dealing with volunteers, anyone who's ever dealt with volunteers knows the sort of challenges which can sometimes come up with volunteers. So this lovely picture is in Brittany with a big swell coming in from the Atlantic. Um, so why do we need a plan? I do like Dilbert. I'm not the only person who likes Dilbert, but and why do we need to plan the plan? My background, I used to run a big product development department for a major multinational, and so I did a lot of planning and commercial planning in my time, and a lot of organising of people to get things done. So trip plans like this and organising trip plans like that seem a little bit more linear and straightforward than some of the things I used to get involved with. Uh, but it probably that background in corporate life probably reflects a little bit in your see in some of the stuff that I show you, that I'm quite a nerdy sort of bloke on the old planning front of things. So I don't necessarily back of the envelope like some people. I may, and I am open to the criticism, too comprehensive. Um, so what are the key reasons we want to plan? And these are the basic stuff, and I'm sure Dave's taken you through a lot of this stuff in the course so far. Um, Obviously, the most important thing in terms of planning trips and expeditions is to make sure that there's an agreement about the scope and the objectives. Really, what are you trying to achieve? And unless you've got a really core idea about that, then how do you measure up what you're planning to do against those scope and objectives? And when you have well put together scope and objectives and aims, then it obviously allows you to get much better buy-in, both from the co-leaders and other people you're going to get involved, sponsors if you're going to use sponsors, and also involvement and engagement of other people as you get them to adopt those objectives in terms of the way that they buy into what you're planning. Um, Also, of course, formal planning allows you then in complex situations to make sure that you've got the resources and the responsibilities outlined as to who's doing what, by when, so that everything works. So that there aren't some awkward issues that arise later in the day where you find out that something major's been missed that you thought somebody clearly had been assigned to get done. Um, Financial projections, especially if you're looking for sponsorship and things, you need to have some clarity in terms of exactly how much money you're going to need. If you're running a commercial outlet, obviously you need to know exactly what sort of margin you want to be working on. There's different ways of doing that. A lot of the stuff I do for the RDT, I have to pay VAT and things on, which is also adds interesting elements to the financial projections that you need to make. So, but having some idea about whether this works, I'm a fortunate guy that I'm retired and I have a sort of okay pension. So actually, most of my guiding doesn't need to make much money. It just helps me pay my tax bill. Actually, it just and when I lose money, I just pay less tax on my pension. So it suits me fine to lose a little bit of money on what I'd be paying for anyway. Um, Obviously, the plan includes the timing and dependencies about different bits and pieces of the project as you put them together. And importantly, and I know Dave have been going through this strongly on the planning side, but we'll also go through it on the customer service side, the risks and challenges and how you're going to actually plan for anything that could potentially go wrong. I won't talk much about that because it's going to be covered for you elsewhere, but I'll talk a little bit in terms of sea kayaking about some of the challenges that sometimes arise. And then, of course, the other thing about having good plans and having structures to it, to what you're doing, is it allows you to be reflective. It allows you to research in advance what you're going to be doing. Um, it allows you to have, active control measures, and it allows you to learn and change what you're doing subsequently because you've got, good records of what you're trying to achieve. Biggest problems with plans, and this really comes from my commercial experience as much as from the sea kayaking side, is that they're not people focused enough. One of the challenges in planning is it's dead easy to plan the hard skill stuff, the concrete stuff. So the concrete stuff's easy to plan, relatively speaking. You need to get the tickets, you need to have the logistics, you need the vans and the vehicles, you need the kit, and that, relatively speaking, that's straightforward. What about planning about what the participants' expectations and what they're going to be getting out of this? What about how the group's going to work? What about how the leaders are going to work together and how they're going to take responsibility for this to make this really, really positive? And I'll come on later to what I think is, the difference between planning as a leader and planning as a guide in terms of actually how it gets much more involved in what you're thinking about your participants' expectations, what you're thinking about trying to provide as an experience, hopefully a transformational experience for people who are coming with you. And a lot of that is also about yourself. As a guide, you're an important part of the mix that's on offer. And so, what you bring to the table is an important part of what the participants get out of whatever you're planning. The other challenge about planning often is that it can inhibit flexibility and spontaneity, and can make you risk averse. Can also become just a document that's just a document, especially when it's just being produced for people to get approval, by an education authority or by a funder or something, and then it's never actually used. What a waste of time that is. So I'm a great believer, if you're going to make a plan, make it a real one that you're really going to use, and make it work, and don't make it too big. Make it so that it's useful. Make it so that it's a communication vehicle for other people, and make it so that you work the plan. The other danger is, and I know Paul knows a lot about this, overselling your plan, because sometimes you may need to do that to get the plan approved. I have never done that myself, but that does sometimes happen. That you oversell. But the main important thing about that is don't kid yourself when you oversell something. So what makes a great sea kayak expedition plan, and a great sea kayak expedition, and how does the plan help? And this, I think, this Delbert slide talks a little bit to the previous point I made, that everyone can do the plans, and they do the conventional plans. Frankly, as a guide, that's mediocrity. That's just table stakes. Sorry, guys, it's table stakes. We need to take it beyond that in terms of what we're doing. But a couple of hot tips. Well, whether they're hot tips or not, you will tell me. And please, anytime questions, guys. Start simple and stay simple. It's so easy to make things more complicated than they need to be. And start with the big picture. Big picture first, the aims and the ethos, as I talked about before. Think very, very hard about what do the participants and what do you want the participants to experience, and do the financial viability. So start with that big framework stuff, and start with options at that big framework side. Don't think that that's, that because you've got to come up with one idea, that's the only idea. Usually, and again, this comes from my commercial experience, usually there's 4 or 5 different things and lots of different ways. Dave's brought his intelligence with him today, but there, you see, that you can do when you're planning an exhibition. It's just so stay open to the idea of new things as you're planning. Stay inspired. It's very, very easy, especially if you reuse plans and redo trips, to just do it again. And actually, I don't know about you, but that's the way to become a boring guide and a boring leader. I am a great believer in adding a frisson of experimentation and new things. Talk about ethos. Understand what your ethos is and what you want. One of my ethoses is I want it to be fun, I want it to be inspiring, and I want it to be a bit anarchic, frankly, because that's the way I am. and the sort of people I deal with, generally older paddlers, that seems to work okay. They quite like that. When you're planning, syndicate's horrible commercial word, but sharing the responsibility for what the plan is and getting people to buy into it is really important. Consult, however experienced a guy you are, however all over the place you've been, there's always other people who've done different things to you, have been to the places you're going to go, have different ways of thinking about it, and it's you have a duty to consult with them and find out about it. Use your connections, use your network to to talk to people about it. And the thing is, ring people up and email them, even if you don't know them, because actually people who plan expeditions and trips love to talk about it. So you'll get loads of stuff out of those guys if you just have the balls to pick up the telephone and talk to people, and they'll give you great input if you tell them what you're trying to do. Use external review, somebody who's not coming with you, who's not involved with your organization, somebody you trust, to have a look at your plan and say, hey, Alan, you're trying to do too much here. You're going to put yourself under a lot of pressure. Change it, cut it down, put some rest days, do some other things. Very important. Shamelessly steal, other people's formats, tools, methods, ideas, risk analysis, whatever. But the only proviso of that, and I'm a great believer, and any materials you see today, you can get off me. I'll give you them all. I have no problem with that at all. Please personalize them, because if you don't actually work them and update them and make them suit the way you think and the way that you work, they won't work as well, and you won't be thinking about really how to make the best out of what you're planning. So I would suggest steal but then modify, make your own. And as I said earlier, the hard stuff's generally more easy to plan. The soft stuff is a little bit more difficult, and depending on your inclination, a lot of people, and a lot of outdoor people are like this. They're better on the hard stuff than the soft stuff, and they need to work harder at the personal working. And then finally, of course, options and contingencies, especially on the sea. The weather can be brutal. You brought people over from all over the place. They've paid loads of money to get to where you're going, and then you tell them, sorry chaps, it's not going to happen. And they may try and put you under a lot of pressure. It's the old Scottish mountaineering expedition thing. Scottish mountaineering thing. We've just spent 7 hours getting here. We're going to go up that mountain, come what bloody may. So you can have a lot of pressure on you to actually do things which are maybe at the limit of the group or beyond the limit of the group. So you need the contingencies, and you need to make those contingencies very clear to the people before you get there, so that they understand how you're going to be making those decisions. Well, the big problem, especially when you've got strong leaders, and I have to watch this. You may not get everyone bought in, because you may get everything prepared and ready and canned up and everything, and they're not bought in and they're not involved in it, and they haven't got the consensus and momentum as a group to help you do what you're trying to do, and they're just coming along as second-class citizens, as co-leaders or co-guides with you. That's not good. That doesn't work. Perfection's the enemy of completion and flexibility. Too much detail makes you less flexible when things go wrong, or you need to cope with different situations than you predicted. And the other big problem about reusing plans is, as I mentioned before, you don't challenge the way you're doing things. You haven't done the self-reflective stuff after you've done things to work out what worked and what didn't work, and you end up doing it again, which is just madness. But we all do it. So here's some basic stuff. Coastal trip planning. Obviously you need to take into account the experience, not just of the group, of you. Be realistic about what you're comfortable doing. The sea is a very exposing master, and things go from pleasant, sunny to really rather nasty, very exposed, extremely quickly. On the Atlantic coast, for example, things happen terribly quickly, and you need to be aware of what your limits are as to, can you look after all the people and all their gear all the time in all the conditions. Out afterwards thinking, shit, that was a bit of a close call. Make a note of it, because you know the next time maybe you're going to do something a little bit different. Obviously, clearly the conditions, and we'll talk a little bit about, the nature of the coastline, the nature of the remoteness of where you are. It makes a big difference as to some of the risks. A dislocated shoulder when you're on the coast and you can get somebody out is pretty different from when you're way out in the middle of nowhere, when a dislocated shoulder becomes a really big deal. So the nature of the coastline, whether you can land, the nature of the remoteness and the implication for emergencies and other things happening, big issue. Sea state, weather, of course, tides, of course. And this chart, and I can share this with you, this is a method. It's sort of built on, I think it's a Gordon Brown thing, actually, this one. It's a trip rating thing that gives you an idea about the level of exposure of a particular trip, and it ends up with a grading scheme. So you score things like the water temperature, breaking waves, all these different categories that you see down the left-hand side down here. And they have scores, and you add them up and divide them by 20, and you get a scoring. It gives you a good idea sometimes. The thing that it does do, which is really, really handy, is it tells you when things are the things that you should be concentrating on. The one that always comes out with me is water temperature. If you're in May on the west coast of Scotland, the water temperature is between 11 and 13 degrees centigrade. You get a lot of points for that, because the level of exposure, if you're a couple of miles off and people swim and get cold and everything, is high. And if somebody gets a whole boat out there and the boat's full of water and you can't empty it properly, things, you've got a difficult situation. So this is a nice little method. Helps get your hand around things, and also allows you to compensate. If something changes. So if the wind speed, say you got a forecast which says later 6 hours, it's going to be up to a 5 or a 6. You put it into the thing and it says, okay, it's changed the trip from a 2 to a 4. Okay, how do I feel about the experience of the group for a 4? Just helps you to get it's the sort of thing I like doing anyway. So enough said. Equipment, obviously, have you got the right equipment for what you're trying to do? Hopefully you all have. And actually the most important thing is the agreed aim. What are the expectations? What are you trying to achieve? What do the punters want to get out of it? What do you want to get out of it? Unless you enjoy yourself, blimey, not much point in doing it. We're not doing outdoor sports for the money, are we? And then obviously you're going to be thinking about the route choices and the fallbacks that happen. Obviously, these are all basic stuff. You can add a lot of things in when you're tripping around the coast. I always try to add a lot of stuff, especially animal stuff. If you've got a lot of ex-whitewater paddlers, they want to be rock hopping, they want to be in and out on the inside. You got people who learn later in their life they want to be half a mile out from the sea, or maybe a mile out from the coast. So there's always some issues. Cave exploration, all those things, all good fun on the sea. Obviously the practicalities, and again the contingencies. In terms of the distances that you can do, it really does depend on the group and the strength of the group. I've done a lot of lightweight expedition stuff with groups, and we'll do, we can do up to 35 nautical miles a day. But that isn't for everybody. That really isn't for everybody. So you need to keep a mind on what really is reasonable, and you also need to keep in mind what the conditions are going to be and how the conditions are going to affect the capability of the group of actually making progress. And the capability of the group making progress is very much dependent on the paddler's capability. So in a following sea, relatively decent paddlers and good paddlers have a fantastic time and can make fantastic progress and can use all the wind and all the waves and can lift their rate by 2 knots or maybe even more. But the poor guys who aren't happy on the sea with the following sea suddenly are going slower than they ever go. So they get a retard associated with the following sea. So all those things are things you need to keep in mind. Big following seas and breaking seas, they are the things that break groups apart. This is more leadership and planning, but you need to keep these things in mind in terms of what you take on, given the group. Plans obviously come in different scales. What I'm talking about a lot today is big plans for big things, but Obviously, you don't need big plans if you're only doing a little day trip down the coast with your mates and or with a small group of quite capable paddlers. That doesn't necessarily need the same magnitude. Um, so what's in the plan? Here's my geek stuff coming out of me. So you know, there's a lot of headings that you can think about, and I won't go through these in detail. Um, but it's nice to have a pro forma to just think about. This is using a thing called mind map. Mind map's really good for laying out, because you can actually add things and think about things and then change the structure a little bit. And then you can use it as a basis for making a document or a spreadsheet or whatever you want to use to manage things. So, um, so I normally start. This is for. I've got a T-shirt on at the moment, which is the T-shirt for an expedition that I should have been doing right now to circumnavigate Jura. Unfortunately, COVID-19 put paid to that. It was going to be with a group of French paddlers that we were bringing over from Brittany. And I usually start, if I'm planning something like that, it was quite a big, well, for wild camping, quite a big number of people. It was 12 people and 3 leaders, which is about the limit as to what you can wild camp on the west coast of Scotland. In fact, actually, ideally, I wouldn't normally have as many as that. I would normally have 2 leaders and 8 maximum on the water for something like a wild camp, just because some of the campsites are not big enough, and actually the whole feeling of the group is not the same when you've got such a big group. You know, it's better to be smaller rather than bigger in that sense. And I start with an overview, and it's like writing the summary. And actually, a lot of what I do is put it onto a website. That is the website that's going to be used for recruiting people to come on the trip. So I write it straight into the website, and I'll usually sort myself out something like this, which is an itinerary for the trip, and with the details on the timing of what the hell's going on when, what are the critical bits, maybe what some of the things we're going to be thinking about, what I'm going to be thinking about in terms of a bit of fun, any cultural events, social things, visits. This particular trip had visits to distilleries in Islay and Jura, so that was part of the theme, because we were bringing over these Brittany guys who've never been there, so actually giving them a flavour of the islands, as well as the nature of the islands, was a part of the trip. But that'd be something I'd start with that, use it to recruit the leaders that I'm going to be using on the trip, and to promote and recruit people into the trip as a starter. And the other key thing about that I do at that stage is budget, to make sure I can make money out of this, or that I can cover my costs. So again, you're welcome to borrow any of these things. I know Dave will have probably supplied you with something similar to this, but you know, a way of actually working out, actually can I actually make any money out of this thing. So thinking a little bit about, I'm a great believer in books and reading and getting behind where you're going. As I say, most of what I do is in the west coast of Scotland. So the basic stuff, you all know this stuff, but you know, obviously you've got resources like almanacs and coastal pilots, cruising pilots, that have a lot of information which is of use, mainly in tidal planning for sea kayaking expeditions. Of course, there are now many more guides that are published for paddling in a lot of areas. They have pros and cons. You know, the pro is that if you've never been there, it gives you some ideas, it gives you trip grading and some things like that. The cons is everybody goes to the bloody places that are in the guide, and you probably don't want to go there if you want to do something which is a bit wilder. So yeah, actually the guide is a good source of actually working out where not to go. Now planning stuff, especially international stuff, there's a lot of different resources that are available that certain countries have different things. So I've just shown you 2 examples here. The top example here is France. This is Point du Raz, biggest tide race in Europe. But the reason for showing you this is that doing the right research, you'll work out that CHOM, which is the French agency, publishes both all the nautical charts, all the maps, and all the tidal data, including tidal stream data by hour, going past all around the French coast. So actually, it publishes data which is significantly better than anything you can get for the UK, significantly better. So in fact, I was able to construct individualized maps with tidal windows and things just by using the SHOM data. These are because the French don't tend to use this approach. This is an approach, with the turning tide sort of times and directions. It's an approach used in England, but it isn't an approach that's used the same way in France. But I was able to transpose from this to get it into the form that I really liked. The other thing I do is I do all these maps for the trips I'm doing because it allows me to add on extra detail like points of interest. These are points of interest, campsites. Again, a point about internet. With Google Earth, and especially with places like Norway, some of the photographic data of the maps is so good that you can work out your campsites before you go there, even if you haven't been there. So this is Norway. This is Lofoten, and you can see I've put camp spots on various places because I've been able to actually look and go down and actually work out that I've got water, I've got flat land, I've got places I can camp. Because of course the other thing about the guides is, and give them their due on this, they don't tell you a lot about the campsites. Well, they tell you about some, but usually those are the ones you want to avoid, as for the reason I said before. So again, using the right research, you can find out what you need for that. I supply a lot of maps to the people who come on trips with me just because I find it's safer to do that, and I'm preparing them for me anyway, so it doesn't cost me anything to do that. I can't sell them because I'd infringe copyright, but hey. The other thing I look at a lot is gazetteers around the place I'm going. So these are the couple that I'd recommend. Obviously, West Coast of Scotland. Scottish Islands is the most fantastic book, which gives you detail and history of every island around the Scottish coast. This is a fantastic book, and it gives you lots of different things that you wouldn't find out easily elsewhere. The other sort of normal gazetteers also help you, obviously, with your planning of the outline trip. But I'd also recommend, if you're going to an area, you should really understand what the history of paddling in the area is. So if you're paddling in Scotland, understand what the history of paddling in Scotland is. From the Canoe Boys through Brian Wilson and Blazing Paddles. I don't know if you know that book, but that's it's the first circumnavigation of Scotland by sea kayak. And more recent stuff like David Gange doing the West Coast of Scotland. He's a historian. So nice to have some of that background. I also try to improve my background knowledge on things like the weather and tides and things. Because obviously you need those skills in terms of the technical skills, but actually understanding where a lot of this stuff comes from historically and things can help you make a more interpretive way of representing that to your clients when you're working with them. I also read a lot of history books on areas I'm going, because otherwise you don't understand. Actually read the newspapers from the areas you're going to as well. Find out what the hell's going on. In the islands, for example, in Scotland, you were worried about what they're not worried. That's why I'm not going there at the minute, because there aren't any of us around there because of COVID. The other thing I'd say is, as a guide rather than a leader, I need to be expert in a lot of different things. Well, not expert, I'm not an expert on these things, but I need to know about a lot of other things. And so actually in the last years, the thing that I've been trying to work on that I thought I was weak on were lots of things like about nature, ecology, and history, and geology and things. Because actually when you're out there, especially with mature groups, actually this is the stuff that allows you to add a lot more interest to your trips. I also have been very interested in getting involved in the understanding the differences in whiskies in different parts of the world, and making sure that I can represent that appropriately around the campfire to the other members of my expedition, as you do. Who to involve? Well, I think I've made it clear, but especially the team and independent review as early as you can. Keep it informal as long as you can, because that keeps your flexibility. It gives you that window to do the research and really think about doing things a little bit differently than you have done before. Talk, and make connections with people who've been there before. There's lots of people in the UK have done lots of expeditioning. As I say, talk to Jeff Allen, talk to Justine, Cunningham. You know, talk to the people who've been to lots of different places. They love talking to you about it. They love talking to you about it. Don't do the stuff you're not good at. Get somebody else to do it. That's a good suggestion. And if you're going to have disagreements about the plan, it's much better to do it when you're planning it, not on the expedition. So disagreements about the plan are a positive, because then you can sort it out before you go. You know, obviously this isn't something you do for every trip, but big trips require roles and responsibilities to be made clear. And again, I think Dave's got something like, you've got something like this, Dave, in one of your things. But roles and responsibilities, how do you, who's going to be doing what? If you've got 3 leaders, or 1 key leader and deputy leaders, however you want to talk it, then who's doing what? You know, don't end up being the guy who has to do everything. You'll be overstressed. You know, when you are actually leading a big trip and you're on the ground and you're responsible for everything day to day on the trip, anyone who's done this knows this. You don't need extra stuff. You've got plenty of stuff on your head that you've got to look after. So actually delegating out is really an essential part of running good trips. You can't take responsibility for everything, especially if you're like me. I like cooking and I like being responsible for some of the food, but I just can't afford to be, you know, having to get onto camp straight away and cook things when I'm responsible for other things on the water. Just can't be done. And make sure the timing's right for that. You know, make sure everyone understands what the timing is for doing what, when. Any questions before we move on? Questions? Anyone? No? Oh dear. So as I said, I think the important thing is getting the ethos and thinking about the people of a trip before anything else. I mentioned when I started, I do a lot of lightweight, fast expeditions with a lot of guys who are ex-competitive paddlers and marathon paddlers. We like getting distance done, but it isn't for everybody. So there's a big difference between a lightweight, fast expedition, especially in the sea kayak, when you're carrying, you know, very little. It's almost like a backpacking exped, light stuff, dried food, nothing, tarp and, nothing, versus a holiday paddle for a group that wants to go around the Scottish Islands, have great food and enjoy themselves. Understand where you are. Understand that if you're running one thing versus the other thing, it's going to make a big difference to what other things you're going to be doing around the trip, how much you're going to add on to it. Are you going to be doing ecological things? Are you going to have rest days? Are you going to have alternative activity days? Are you going to have things around camp that you're going to do differently as a result of that? You're going to have social activities, fun and games. If you're doing big, long, lightweight fast, you've only just about got enough time to paddle and to eat, and then you're knackered and you sleep, and then you get on the boat again and off you go. So you don't think about any of those other things. So very, very critical that you get the mix right, and that you understand where you are and your team are, and that it's all consistent when you're selling the exped, and that it's consistent and explained to your participants so they understand what they're getting into. We had some discussion in the last couple of weeks about Maslow and people not liking Maslow. So there's Maslow and there's inverted Maslow, by the way. So you can have one or the other. But I think the reason I'm putting this up is understand what the motivation of your participants are as a guide. Some people like having a hard time and being put under pressure and completing and saying I'll manage that even though I got frostbite and all that sort of stuff. But not everyone's in for that. Actually, this was a survey that was done in 2017 for Adventure Travel Trade Association in the US, but it's talking about what the expectations about people are on exped, and they're different than a lot of active activities people might initially think. So, in the past, you might think it's all about risk and adventure, unique experience, and that sort of thing. Actually, this survey seemed to indicate that people are going to a sort of different place. They're wanting transformative experiences about personal growth for themselves. They're wanting to broaden their perspective. They're wanting to develop themselves. They're wanting to learn things. So actually, if you want to offer a really fantastic experience, that's the sort of stuff you need to be thinking about, not just the adventure elements. And one of the things as I say, I'm very keen on food. So unfortunately that shows. very keen on food and very keen on adding value-added stuff associated with food and whiskey and drinks and things. So I always add lots of social events and things in the evening if it's a holiday-like type expedition, so that we have some fun and we get the group to bond and to become become to have an experience that they're really going to remember. Planning for uncertainty. Dave's going to take you through a lot more of this than I am. I'm only going to have one slide that's only losers plan for failure. Yeah. Obviously, these are just obvious stuff. Building slack and extra provisions. Yeah, of course. But it's amazing how many people don't. We're going to go around here in 5 days. It's 40 kilometers a day. If we have one bad day, we're stuffed, and the tides are all wrong and we're not going to make it. No, you can't do that. Maintain multiple alternatives and make them clear to the punters and to your co-leaders exactly what they are, so that you've got alignment. As part of the safety and management, you need to plan the unwilling exit points, as I call them. You also need to plan the alternative activities. The big thing that happens, especially on the west coast of Scotland, is that even if you're in May, it can be like bloody November. And how are you going to manage it? You've suddenly got you've got a big gale coming in from the west that means you can't go up the coast that you were planning to go up. You're stuck. What are you going to do? Well, it does help to have the right gear. It does help to have nice food, nice cocoa. Cocoa's a euphemism, by the way, for other things that you drink. So a big monster tarp is helpful, especially a monster tarp that you can get a fire under. But even that can be a bit of a problem by the seaside. Obviously, the west coast, there's not many trees. So if the weather's blowing a gale, actually keeping your tarp up can be quite an issue. So you have to work quite hard. We have taken over derelict buildings and things. That's a way of doing it sometimes when you have to. So key takeaways. There's a big difference in planning as a guide versus planning as a leader. A leader, you do the nuts and bolts. A guide, you add the value-added stuff on top to make it a really meaningful experience for your participants. As a guide, it's a continuous development journey. You may know quite a lot, but you don't know as much as everyone. There's plenty still to learn. You need skills and knowledge in a hell of a lot of areas. You need to hone your own emotional intelligence and your people skills and your humility. You're managing groups. Sometimes you need to be a psychiatrist, a nanny, obviously a paramedic, lots of different things. So you need lots of skills, people skills. And remember, as the guide, you're actually a big value-added part of the whole thing. So actually, you're part of the adventure and you're part of the experience for the people who are coming on it. So how you are, how you interact with the group is really, really a critical part of making that adventure good for them. Learn to delegate, build your peripheral expertise. And as I said to you, I think one of the things after you gain a lot of experience as a guide or a leader, actually share your resources with people. So I share all my resources with anyone who uses them, and I look for feedback from people to say how can I improve them. So I add lots of things to people who come on my trips so that they can identify animals and cetaceans and things. Songbooks and round the fire stuff. All important maps, as I mentioned. So all important stuff that you can provide. So last slide, last thing. Informal and top line first, detail and delegate later. Focus on the people and ethos first, concrete stuff later. Consult, research and review widely. Perfection's the enemy of creativity and completion. Any questions? And these are all my expeditions, which would have happened this year, but are going to happen next year now, hopefully. Hopefully. And this is my t-shirt for that one. Sorry, you can't see that, for that one. Any questions, guys?
I can't believe Paul hasn't got a question.
Especially after I was rude about him.
I was really impressed with some of the documents. Are you all right sharing some of that stuff? Because it's a lot better than what I've got, if I'm honest.
Absolutely no problem, Paul. Yeah, no problem. And please tell me what you don't like so I can update them.
Paul, are you trying to say it's a lot better than the stuff I've given you?
I
think that was a taken, Dave. Dave's got a copy of the plan that I did for this Jura thing actually somewhere. I don't know if you got it somewhere, Dave, haven't you? But I can certainly provide copies to any of this stuff.
Alan, are you okay for me to let people have your email address?
Yeah, of course I am. Yeah.
Brilliant. Because if you have his email address, then you can sign up for one of his expeditions as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. When we start again, whatever that is. Yes, please come to Lofoten next year.
Anybody got any questions for Alan? He can't have stunned you all into silence.
This was a With Dave production.